I think just as a result of being in the Chinese culture, there's a saying called 一切尽在不言中, which means a lot of things are left in the unsaid. I don't think before I came to the US, I knew how to properly advocate for myself. I knew how
Mhm.
to ask for help. And just because you're looking at my straight A transcript doesn't mean that I'm not struggling.
You briefly talk about like after you quit the job as an admission officer and then you went back to school and you went to Harvard to continue study education. I remember we talked like a couple months ago like about your like journey in Harvard. You were very happy. So I'm curious, what prompted you to take that step and how has it contributed to your growth, both personally and professionally?
Of course. And I think I touched upon this a little bit in terms of my journey to grad school and my dorky little vision boards. So for me, grad school was not a spur of the moment decision. I always knew that I wanted to go to grad school. So the thing that I needed to figure out is what for. When I was at Princeton, the two areas that I was interested in the most was psychology and kind of international cross-cultural education. So then, and again, like I mentioned, there wasn't an education major for me to take more. I took as many education classes as I could, but as a result of my major, all of the undergrad classes pertaining to education were focused on ed policy, which is a super important area. It's a lot of, data analysis because in order to make a policy, you need data. And so I had that skill set, but I knew that that's not quite what I wanted in life. So then I worked as an admission officer, and I took a step back. I thought about enjoying the work with families and students. I thought about the fact that I loved the psychology class I took. So then I put all those things in one board and thought to myself, what academic area allows me to mash all of these together, and it's children's psychology, like educational counseling. So pretty naturally that led me to applying and eventually getting into the Harvard Grad School of Education, where I learned the major is called human development and education. So all the like children's psych, all the counseling classes will fall under this major. So essentially we focused on how children learn, how they develop, how the family school partnerships work. So many things that you already heard. The vocabulary was provided for me, the theories, the scaffold were all there as a result of my grad school education.
I think you mentioned a very like important term is what for, because like a lot of people like go to grad school before they really even know what they want in their life, but they try to avoid like the being like in the society, work for a company and get a job they don't love. So they just go to school and study MBA degree or degrees they don't know if that was to pursue. Where like after they got the degree, they don't know which industry they want in, well, what jobs they want. But you just mentioned like this is what you want, and you combine. You have the vision board, you have all the things, you combined the things you want to study, and then you go to the Harvard School. I think that's something like when people go for next steps, they don't just like 头脑一热, you really calculate in your head and you know what you want for the next step. That's quite like people need to learn from like from you, from what you just did, and to continue to do. And after the Harvard graduation, you went back to school and you be a counselor and pursue your dream.
Absolutely. I love that observation. And I think that goes back to my very first, it wasn't even a question when we were chatting about my experience being home for the first time in a long time, the idea of like Juan and what for. They're kind of the antithesis of each other. If you're just Juan all the time, Juan means, I don't even know if I could adequately define it. It just means like working, being busy all the time. If you're doing that, you wouldn't have time for the deep existential questions of like, what do I want? What for?
Mhm.
And I definitely, Victoria, I saw that with my own eyes. For my friends who were in grad school, some of them came straight out of college into grad school. And during like the job season, the job search starting around like mid-March, they really had a difficult time because they have never thought of what they wanted. And now, and their like master's degree might not have anything to do with their undergrad degree, apart from like the big shiny Harvard name. And like, let's face it, that will be a plus everywhere. But if you don't have your story straight, how are you going to stand out during an interview? So I think going to grad school, just in a sense, for many students, delayed their self-discovery
Mm.
process. It's not going to go anywhere. It's not going to go away. It's just delayed. And for better or for worse, that's the fact. And the harsher fact is grad school is freaking expensive. It's very much a decision that students shouldn't make lightly, even if they're lucky enough that their families could help them. I'm not. I'm still paying. I just paid my student loan before hopping onto this meeting. So I think maybe perhaps, and this is my big speculation, perhaps in a sense, a lot of my friends in the US don't take grad school lightly because of the financial piece. And a lot of my friends in back home in China, they could be the only child in their family in like the last two generations. So all the resources are poured onto one child. That's very different from my friends here who come from families of four or five. It's the difference is night and sky. So I think if this piece is removed from the equation, then students, it might result in a haste decision when it really shouldn't have been. So for those of you who are listening and pondering whether grad school is the right next step for you, really take some time to think whether it is. Is this what you want? What does this lead to? It's a step in an equation, and it shouldn't just be, oh, just for the sake of getting a master's or getting a PhD. That's not a good use of your time. That is not a good use of your own resource or your family's resource. So yeah, that's a long way of saying I agree with your observation, Victoria.
I wonder if you can touch on a little bit, Victoria mentioned what it felt like, and you touched on like being back, sort of this idea of like Bärenjährerreise. I think that if people were to look at you on paper, you see all of these different things like, wow, she went to boarding school and then she went to Princeton and right, and then she did this and now she has this job. And like, from the outside looking at your situation, it's like you're living this dream. And we know in the US, right, there's this concept of the model minority, right? Something that is used in a lot of harmful ways, despite the idea that like, you are supposed to be the model that everyone's going to look up to. And I imagine in the Chinese context it must be challenging as well, because if people have this sort of expectation for you to achieve, and I assume to continue to achieve this, it's probably hard to just be like, okay, I've done enough, I can just end here and live my life. I'm wondering if you could touch on like how one, like if this has come up in your life experience, it's like, model minority and how that's affected your journey, and what sort of advice or words you could share for individuals who might be navigating the pressure to conform to expectations.
Absolutely. And as a matter of fact, I constantly think about this concept. I wrote my senior thesis on it, on the kind of, long story short, like the impact of the model minority myth on students. And mom, if you're listening, you just called me 别人家的孩子, so we made it. And to that point of model minority, I constantly think about it the way that my current office is set up. I do have my memorabilia from my Princeton and my Harvard days, and I realize that the impact of that, like it could be hypocritical for me to advise students on pursuing what they love. with me hanging two Ivy League titles above, literally, like the walls behind me, like the titles were above my own head. I realized that, I recognize that, and I don't have a good answer for, how to not make my students and their families feel the pressure of going to these schools where I'm the one doing the talking. But I think, for me, it just, I had other schools on my list. I had other options. Princeton worked out for me in terms of affordability. It's got one of, honestly, the best financial aid programs in this country. I was able to go to school for free and come out without a student loan, which puts me so much ahead of so many of my peers. So I think even for students who might not, like have that worry, I still think this is a piece worth exploring, the scholarships, the financial aid. It's worth considering. And I think that is one of the biggest differences I observe between like my Chinese friends and now working on the other side of the desk, like the US students applying, like the idea of cost is constantly in the equation for my US friends, and versus in China, it's kind of the whatever it takes, like 砸锅卖铁, we will send this kid, we will make sure the student gets educated. So that's really different. And I think, and I'm going on a tangent, but it's essentially for those of you who are listening, cost matters, take that into consideration. Going back to the model minority question, I think, I am, like you said, on surface, a product of a walking model minority. I've always gotten good grades. I've always been pretty high achieving at school growing up, even when I was struggling in Beijing with the insomnia, my grades were still up. But that's the thing, like that's what you see on paper is different from what the child is experiencing inside. And I think, so we often say that the curse of model minority is that you assume these students don't struggle. You assume that these working at a school, these are the high flyers, they're gonna be fine. We don't have to check in on them as often. So that's the harm of the model minority, that students might be struggling, but the struggles are invisible. I think just as a result of being in the Chinese culture, there's a saying called 一切尽在不言中, which means a lot of things are left in the unsaid. I don't think before I came to the US, I knew how to properly advocate for myself. I knew how to ask for help. And just because you're looking at my straight A transcript doesn't mean that I'm not struggling. The fact that I'm talking to you nowadays, this is a product of work. This is me calmly saying, sometimes I need help. But the journey from the young me to this, that took probably 7 years of reflection and therapy, and acknowledging that it's okay to cry, it's okay to struggle, it's okay to say, I need help. So I think just the long story short, the curse of the model minority is students being trapped in this bubble, thinking that because I'm the model, I shouldn't be asking for help. I shouldn't break. I'm supposed to be the one where nobody worries about. And that's extremely harmful to the student's own development. Like pain and struggles are not going to process if you just bury it. Again, it's only delayed, and if anything, accumulated to a later stage where if it does explode, it could be detrimental. So I think, and I'm for the rest of my life going to be an advocate on Chinese students asking for help. It's so important and so undervalued in a society that's so competitive since the start. If again, going back to the testing stories in China, like whether you're doing well or not is dependent on the test. If you're doing well on the test, you're fine, and that just to me shouldn't be the case. Even in the US, I would say I see the transcript of students, like when, and I'm sure EJ you agree, like when you're doing your advisory check-ins, typically we're checking in more on students who are either getting a tank in their grades, or students who, attendance wise might not be showing to class 2 days in a row. That doesn't fit the profile of most of the Asians, or at least like the Chinese American students that I know. So what are ways that we could catch these students? What are ways that we could perhaps recognize those invisible struggles is really what I want to dedicate the rest of my life to.
Mm, mm. It's interesting that you bring a lot of that up. I find that there's a lot of parallels with that in like Black and African American communities, particularly around like the idea of Black excellence, right? Like you always have to be excellent. And when you're not, it's like, what do you do? And now I feel like I'm not living up to these expectations that I'm supposed to have. And it ends up being pretty toxic for people who, like you said, like aren't able to sort of step out of that framework. And then like even from just like the model minority of it all, that, you know, like that then is used against other people, right? That idea that if you aren't living up to that. So I appreciate you sharing that and like how that has been challenging, because I think like you said, like yeah, people will see your story and assume they're like, oh, like she's had it made, silver spoon, all of these things. And I, not to say that there's something necessarily wrong with that, but I think that, you know, it's worthwhile sitting in some of that nuance. So thank you for sharing some of the challenges around that. And hopefully for people who are going through similar things or who have gone through it, you know, and if you haven't been able to move out of that, hopefully that helps give you some clarity there. So thank you for sharing that.
Absolutely.
I think your journey is now like, as other people see, like she is brilliant and she work hard and she gets into the good school and she can encounter all the challenges. I think your journey is more like a testament for resilience, and also you are like ambitious to know what you want. Can you share any pivotal moments or lessons from your life that you believe could inspire other young individuals, particularly those striving to make their own dream, pursuing their own dream in whether in education or in their life?
Yeah, and I think I'm happy to share, kind of like going along nicely with the mono minority bits, the talking points. And for thank you, EJ, for sharing your own nuances, adding to the mono minority. And this phenomenon by no means only applies to Asian Americans. Minority being minority, so it also applies to Black, Latinx communities of individuals who are marginalized and who could be seen as the minorities in at least the US. So definitely a phenomenon, a concept that applies to many. And in terms of my, I guess like a challenge, a pivotal moment, it happened during my freshman fall in college, where imposter syndrome really hit me. Imposter syndrome, in a nutshell, means constantly questioning your own belonging at a space where you feel like you don't belong. In other words, you're gaslighting yourself every single day. So that's how I felt when I first got to Princeton. And I auditioned for many different music organizations. So I love music. I played the flute and the piccolo growing up. And during the first 2 weeks, when all the clubs are encouraging you to sign up, I did. And I got rejected from 12 music organizations. And that has honestly never happened in my life. And at the time, like now I'm totally fine, but at the time it seems like the world came crashing down. You know, I was not getting good grades. I was not, like, there was, when it's an English or a history class, like students were like so elegantly and eloquently putting their points out on the round table discussions, and I was terrified in those classes. So, you know, school was not going well for the first time in my life, which is an anchored piece of my identity. And now music wasn't going well either. You know, I was a crap flute player who couldn't get into anything. And then in terms of social life, I was kind of also struggling. I felt like at the time I had to pick and choose, like whether to hang out with friends who are all from China or whether to hang out with, there's like a weird little boarding school pock too in colleges, like that's a thing. Or hang out with, you know, students who might have gone through the American public school system. So there were like these different pocs forming, and I found myself as a result of a third culture kid, like being in the middle, like not knowing where I belong. So all of these things were happening at once. And I really, really struggled. I really thought, I was a nobody, and that's not okay, because I'm supposed to be the model minority. I'm supposed to be somebody. And there were friends, figuring stuff out. My roommates, I was living in a quad, so I had 3 roommates. One of them just completely stepped out of this whole like club competition thing, so she was fine. She's smart. She like figured it out way before me. And then the two others, one got into like the most competitive dance group, and then the other got into PUO, Princeton University Orchestra, which is so hard to get into. And I was comparing myself to them. I was comparing myself to the Birnzada-Heize, and that was extremely unhealthy, and it made me very unhappy. And I started not showing up to classes for the first time in my life. I started to just, watch TV shows in my own room. And what I didn't realize at the time, but now realize, is that's called a depression. I was extremely depressed. And I was like, now that I went to grad school, I was like, yep, all the symptoms were there. The loss of appetite and the ridiculous amount of sleep I needed to get every day. So yeah, guys, I was depressed for, like probably an entire semester at Princeton, until eventually I went home during Christmas break, seeing my family for the first time in a long time. That was really healing. And then I was also talking to some friends from other schools that for some reason I just didn't talk to. I didn't want to tell people that I was having a hard time. But when I was home, when it was face to face, it kind of made it easier. And I realized, oh, like maybe the other students' lives weren't going as gloriously as I thought. The TikTok, the Instagram feeds, that's just a fleeting moment in someone's life. So if you're just looking at the surface level, you don't know what's going on. And I think those face-to-face talks really affirmed me that I wasn't alone in this. And I had a friend who, she's very open about her feelings. I love her. And she said, like, just go to therapy. It's free anyways. Like, use the school's money when you can. Something along those lines. And I was like, oh, what the heck? I'll try it. That started my whole therapy journey. And it really, really helps. It works. And I got better. And then I had an amazing, like the rest of like 3.5 years at Princeton. So again, like if students were scrolling through my Instagram and looking at my first fall semester at Princeton, they wouldn't know how much I was struggling. Gosh, how many classes I didn't show up to. And I think we should normalize talking about this kind of struggle, and it's really, really okay. The thing that would be more harmful is to bury it in yourself and to not talk about it. So here I am telling you about my struggle and how it was crucial for me to experience that, to learn how to ask for help.
Yeah, I just think it's so important, right? Like, and it's interesting because I do think that we're in a time where, thankfully, to social media, right? Like the discussion of sort of therapy or just vulnerability and like talking about yourself. I mean, it's like so much to the point, like it's affected, I feel like, mainstream culture, that like even on shows like The Bachelor and Bachelorette, if people watch those shows, I don't really, but my sister sometimes forces me to watch them with her. Like they talk about like, like you have to open up and you have to talk about things. So, whether it's in the school context or there, it's so important. I think especially because, as you mentioned, with imposter syndrome, right? Like this idea that like I don't belong here can be really hard to shake, because if you think about so many systems and especially schools, like they're not designed for many people to be there, right? It's like why there's all these special initiatives to recruit certain types of people there, because the school was never built for you. So it's not surprising that people feel that way. It's just unfortunate that it persists. So I'm wondering, right, like you are an educator, you've been in different systems, you've been in different cultures, you've had different roles in different spaces. What do you envision are changes or innovations that, educational institutions can make to help people of different sort of cultural backgrounds, diverse backgrounds, like feel like they're included, that they belong. And you can talk generally, or if there's something like particular to, say, Chinese or Chinese Americans that you want to touch on. But yeah, very curious what you think schools, institutions, places, people can be doing to, help people feel like they belong and they're included in those spaces.
Absolutely. And I think these innovations or changes will look different on different like grade level, like K-5 might look different from colleges, like, and if we're going really granularly, each year could have different programs put in place. That's way too detailed, and I think on the broad surface, and I'm going to quote probably my favorite professor at Princeton, and he once said, if you want to change everything that's wrong with the society in America, you really should be looking at K-12. You really should be changing the K-12. So I think I would like to pivot, like kind of steal that idea and use it here. And I think if we want, educational innovation to really educate students on the importance of cultural diversity and inclusivity, we should be looking at K-12. That could mean having pictures of Black and brown children on the picture books at a pre-K reading carpet. That could mean having novels written by authors from all across the world instilled into like a third grade English curriculum. And that could mean, recognizing that, having these conversations, it could mean I guess like fostering the ability to have these conversations starting as early as like 5th grade or 6th grade. Because if we are doing that at the high school level, at the college level, it's honestly too late. We really should be doing that during the developmental years of students. And we should be educating the families, the communities too, that are raising the student, because it could be very stressful for students if they're hearing one thing at school and hearing another on the family level. So I think, and this is me saying that in an ideal world, all the forces come together to embrace this idea. And I know that that might not always be the case, but I think starting from, I just think that so many places nowadays have affinity groups and they kind of just check a box and leave it at that. That is not enough. An affinity group at a school meets maybe 2 hours every 2 weeks. We should be doing more than that. And affinity groups are by design only for students in that group. So the in-group and out-group idea is there. In order to truly embrace inclusivity, we need the out-groups to also embrace these ideas. And I think on the school level, the best way to do that is to incorporate that into the curriculum. So in a sense, there's no escape. You have to learn about this, whether you like it or not. And hopefully by the end of that semester, you'll come to like it.
Yeah, I hope more schools are able to do that. I think that would make the world of difference, not only
Absolutely.
for those students like in the minority and in those small groups, but like for the whole community, right? Like
Yeah,
everyone,
and
like you
I think
said,
there is
has to
hope. Like
agree.
I'm seeing that. I'm seeing that at some schools. So hopefully, like everyone could work on the same side, and hopefully that could even be a requirement by the DOE. We'll see.
Every time I talk to a close friend, like I really enjoy the conversation because this conversation makes me to learn more about you, Angela. It's like even though we talk a lot, like last time we met in person, probably like in 2018, like
Yeah.
we know like we're a very good friend, but we barely talk about like deep conversation about like your journey. So like I really enjoy this conversation and also really love to hear from you. So anything else you want to share with us? Anything you want to help like our listeners? Any advice? Any suggestions you want to give?
I guess, and I have said that, but it's really important to take a pause. So if you have gotten to this point in the podcast near the end, I hope that you could, close out your phone after this and just, take a pause, make some time for yourself. It's really important to 放空, to allow yourself to not think about anything for a little bit in order to go faster after that. So I think it's not always go time in life. It's really, really important to give your mind a break.
We hope that you found Angela's journey as inspiring as we did. Her story is a testament to the power of perseverance, ambition, and the pursuit of education. As we wrap up this episode, we encourage you to reflect on your own educational journey and the unique perspectives you bring to the table. Remember that every path is a story worth telling, and that diversity in experiences enriches our collective narrative. Thank you for joining us today. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with your friends and community. Your support keeps our podcast going, and we look forward to bringing you more inspiring stories in the future. Until next time, keep dreaming, learning, and embracing the journey of life. Bye.
Bye.
For having me.